This podcast is for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome back to From Crime to Crime.
Hey, buddy. How's it going?
I'm fine. Nobody cares. You ready to get into it?
Well, before we get into it, do you have any housekeeping items?
Oh, I do. Thank you for reminding me because I would have totally forgotten. We got 2 more 5-star rate and reviews. So, gbaby_forever. I like that one. Gbaby. The title is This is the Truth. Says, the first episode I listened to was Rodney Alcala. Great job. As I listened, I didn't want to like you guys. Sorry, Erica. You remind me of my stepmom, which only makes sense why I rejected it first, but grew to love with time. I love this show, and I'm happy you guys are back. That's high praise. The fact that you got her to love this, even though you sound like her stepmom, I think that's fantastic.
Well, baby, I promise I won't date your dad.
The other one, not that all of our 5-star rating reviews aren't tremendous, but they add a little weight when they come from other podcasters. And so we got this one from Crime Soup Podcast. This says, I recommend your podcast to everyone who asks for suggestions. From Crime to Crime is my favorite all-time show. Let me know if you're ever in Salt Lake City and I'll buy you guys a drink. Thank you so much, Crime Soup, and you're clearly not Mormon. That's high praise. So we really take that to heart, and thank you so much.
I love how you just assume everybody from Utah is LDS.
Well, I mean, isn't that kind of everyone's assumption?
I don't know. Maybe. Anyways, thanks, Hannah and Kaylee, for the great review.
Absolutely.
And if anybody else is looking for another true crime podcast, Crime Soup is where it's at.
Most definitely. We highly recommend it. But for our show, where are we going to this week?
We're going to St. Louis, Missouri. February 28th, 1983.
February 1983. I'm going to guess, honestly, Porter Wagner.
No.
Oh.
I don't even know why you're guessing anymore.
It is a fun game to play. So am I right, though? Is it Porter Wagner?
No, it was Charlie Pride.
See, you didn't even want to do it and you still knew what was up.
Well, of course I knew. That's the first thing I look up.
Really? Why?
It doesn't matter. It's just like a weird tick that I have. I don't know.
It sets your tone?
It's probably a mental illness.
Yeah, it definitely is. But it just sets your tone. Is that kind of like it puts you like, okay, I know where we're at because Charlie Pride was rocking the airwaves?
Yes.
Interesting.
Okay, so we're going to St. Louis, Missouri. We're going to Clemens Avenue. There's an abandoned apartment building that's been abandoned for a few years. And this story's been told and retold a lot. And it's always the same story about these 2 guys whose car broke down. And they were looking for like a metal pipe to fix their car. So they went into the basement of this abandoned building. In every retelling, they're like, that doesn't really make any sense, but whatever. Then recently, there was a guy who did a documentary on this case. And he's like, that doesn't make sense. And he kind of set out to clear up a bunch of stuff. And this documentary is fantastic. It's on Prime, and it's called Precious Hope Revisited. And he completely clears this up, that there was no 2 guys that were broken down car. They weren't looking for a pipe. They were just neighborhood teenagers that were fucking around in an abandoned apartment building.
I mean, that really makes the most sense, right? Like teenagers, especially in this time,
totally.
Like they had to entertain themselves. Dude, teenagers back then had so much more fun than teenagers now do. Like teenagers now are so safe in their house and like everything's protected. Like teenagers back then were like getting tetanus.
Yeah.
What a life.
These 2 neighborhood teenagers, they were older, like 18, 19. They were adults, but they weren't grown men.
But they were the size of grown men, so it's understandable how that gets mixed up.
Yeah, no, it's not. There's a lot of stuff in this story that gets mixed up, and it's not understandable.
Oh.
It's actually kind of wild.
All right. Well, I'll just shut up and listen.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, this documentary on Amazon Prime is actually really, really cool because they have a lot of interviews with the actual detectives on the case, the actual police department on the case.
Oh, that's cool.
So one of these guys lights a lighter in the basement. They say it's because it's dark down there and they can't see, but maybe they were smoking something. Who knows?
Oh, yeah. 83? Absolutely.
Yeah. They realize, though, in the glow of the lighter, that there is a woman's body in the basement of this abandoned apartment building.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
What?
It's bad. It's not like somebody was down there and froze to death or OD'd or something. It's shocking.
Even if they had OD'd or froze to death, this would be shocking. And like, you're only able to see this from the glow of your lighter? Oh.
Yeah, it's scary. She's face down with her hands tied behind her back with red and white rope. She had red fingernail polish on. She's naked from the waist down. And she has on a yellow sweater that's covered in blood.
Wow. This is horrific. Like, what a terrible sight to see by candlelight.
The most horrific part of it, though, is that she was decapitated.
Oh, I didn't see that coming at all.
Yeah, and her head was nowhere at the scene. Not that they could see anyway, but it would turn out that it was not at the scene.
What do you do with a head? Why would somebody decapitate somebody else and then like take their head with them? What do you do with that? Why do you have that? Oh.
Well, I'm sure they didn't keep it, but I'm sure it was to, hinder identification, which turns out, since we're doing an episode on her 40 years later, worked.
Wow.
So these kids run back to their house and they call the police. When the police arrive, at first they thought that she might be a sex worker. A trick maybe turned bad. Maybe she was doing tricks in this. Apparently this neighborhood is a little bit, at this time, kind of crime-ridden.
Yeah.
But when they turned over her body, they found out very quickly that she was not an adult.
Oh. Again, didn't see that coming.
Yeah, she was a child. She was a prepubescent child.
Oh. Wow.
Yeah.
Oof. That is tough to think about.
Yes. She was probably between the ages of 7 and 11.
Jesus. Just a little baby, man.
Yep. During the autopsy, they found out that the decapitation was extremely violent, obviously, and brutal, but it was performed post-mortem, so she was not alive.
I mean, if there's a silver lining, I guess that's it, but it's not much.
Yeah. Unfortunately, what was not post-mortem was the violent sexual assault, the beating, and the probable strangulation that she suffered.
Man.
And they figured this out because there was nothing in her stomach contents, like no food. The only thing that was in her stomach contents was blood and in her lungs, which means she aspirated blood and swallowed blood while she was still alive.
Okay.
And according to the medical examiner, that can only happen if you have blood in your nose and your mouth and you're still breathing.
Jeez.
So,
I hate all of this.
Yeah. She had some pretty extreme injuries to her vaginal area also, like tearing and bruising. This was a violent, brutal murder.
I mean, to say the least, it sounds like it's an awful attack, and it's always worse when it's a kid. So now it's 10 times worse.
But there's like zero chance that this was like an accidental death and then somebody freaked out and dumped her body. Like,
oh no.
This was brutal.
This was meant to do what it did.
Yes. So interestingly, what they don't find is evidence of any long-term abuse. All of her injuries were all around the time of her death. Like, she seemed normal development-wise for a child her age, 7 to 11. She seemed not malnourished or any signs of broken and healed bones, nothing like that. Bruising that had already healed. Like, she seemed like she had a pretty not horrific life up until her death.
So, I mean, just trying to think of like how she gets in a situation like this then.
Yeah.
I would understand it being apparent if they had marks on them already or, some other kinds of signs of trauma. But I mean, this sounds like it was just probably like an abduction or something.
Yeah. So over the years, it's been widely reported by credible sources like newspaper articles that she had spinal bifida occulta, which is like a very mild form of spinal bifida.
Oh, okay, cool.
That sometimes...
So she can walk and stuff?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Sometimes people who have it don't even know they have it.
Oh.
Like, remember when my brother got in that really bad motorcycle accident and they left him taped to the backboard after they airlifted him to that hospital?
No, that was...
Because they thought he broke his back.
No, that was before my time, but I do remember you telling me about it.
Yeah, well, he had seizures and stuff, so they were, like, super worried about his brain, but when they did the full-body x-rays and stuff, they thought he broke his back, but it was some kind of something like that, where it was, like, a mild form of spinal bifida. Anyway, he didn't even know he had it. You would never know, whatever.
Oh, crazy.
So that's been what's reported on this case forever. It was that she had a mild form of, but this documentary that I was telling you about that this guy just released pretty much found out that that's like a total rumor that somehow just got like put into the narrative and has always stayed in it.
Oh, so that's not actually true?
No.
Oh. Is it spinal bifida or spina bifida?
I don't know.
I think it's spina bifida. That's why I was asking.
Long story short, she didn't have it. So that's been reported on for years that she might have had spinal bifida or spina bifida, whatever the fuck.
It's spina bifida and spinal stenosis.
Either way, she didn't have it. So people may have been like, oh, I have a cousin I haven't seen in 20 years, but she didn't have spina bifida, It's kind of sad that there's been a lot of misreporting on this case, like a lot of rumors that got put into the narrative as if they're real.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That just helps. That just confuses things longer and keeps these things, unsolved.
Well, it also gives families who don't want to believe that this could be their niece or their granddaughter. So they're like, oh, well, my granddaughter didn't have that, so it's not mine. When there's stuff like this that's wrong, that's kind of scary in Jane Doe cases. So,
yeah.
No spina bifida. The police believe this little girl is obviously going to be reported missing anytime now. Doesn't seem like she was neglected or abused or anything like that before this happened. So they think like a family at some point is going to call and report her missing. But that never happens.
Which, that in and of itself is also just amazing, right? Like,
yeah.
How is there nobody reporting this? Unless, obviously, they're not from that area. But,
know.
The chances of that.
Even still, though.
Yeah, man.
Even still, though, because they searched high and low. We'll find out what they do over the next 40 years. But even if she was reported missing in a different area, they would have connected it by now.
Yeah.
So when no leads come in, they start canvassing the local area, around the crime scene.
Right.
And they're looking for eyewitnesses who saw people going in and out of the building. Maybe somebody saw a car. And also they were looking for her head.
We might get into this later, but what happened to these boys? Are they suspects or just not part of the story anymore?
No, I mean, they were at first, and I'm sure they were investigated, but the police say that they never suspected them of anything. They were young, and this kind of fucked them up.
Yeah.
So the police say they're not suspects. But they canvass the area also looking for her head. So they have to look in dumpsters and drainage ditches and woods, anywhere they can. But they find nothing.
Seriously, what do you do with a head?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if you can't find it in this, the only thing I can think is this person dug a deep hole and buried it so the dogs couldn't find it. But I mean, God, it wouldn't have to be a very large hole, but it would have to be a very deep hole, and that's still a lot of work.
Or he got rid of it in a much more remote location or, in a different state. It does seem odd, though. Why wouldn't he just get rid of both things in the same place? But
again, what type of person just walks around with a human head?
I don't know, but I don't think he kept it. I think he separated the head from her body to mess with identification, which turned out to work because they don't know who this little girl is.
Yeah, you're right.
So I think he just dumped her head in a different location than her body, and her body happened to be found, but her head wasn't. And think about where he dumped her body. If those kids hadn't been fucking around in that basement, she may have never been found. She may have been skeletal by the time they tore that building down in 1999.
Yeah, it's very true.
It took 20 years to tear that building down. She would have been skeletal. She may have just been demolished with the building.
Yeah, you're very right.
Yeah. So when they got no leads from the neighbors, because everybody, I don't know, I didn't see nothing. You know how that goes.
Yeah.
So when they have no leads from the neighbors, they check with the local schools because they're like, well, this little girl has to be missing school. But that's a giant mess because apparently in the 80s, school records, like attendance records and stuff, weren't computerized. They were all manual. And that was only if the schools did them. They didn't all do them.
Right.
And they had some sort of secretary shortage at this time. So it was super time consuming for the police because they would call a school and be like, do you have any girls who haven't shown up in a couple of days? And the school would give them 5 names. And then they'd have to track down all 5 of those kids. And some were at different schools. Some were just truant. And they would have to call every single school and do that. And then the schools would call back a week later and be like, oh, we didn't know, but this girl hasn't been here or that girl, they just didn't keep very accurate records.
That's one thing, as time has gone on, we have done right as society has kept much better track of people and things. And yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've done a lot poorly
Totally.
as a society, but that's one thing we've done really well.
Yeah. But they had to track down every truant kid, every absent kid, everything, every kid who transferred schools. Because apparently they used to just transfer schools and not tell the old school. They just start them at a new school. Apparently that happened a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely see how that just is just yep, the transfer schools. Oh, okay. Well, less work for us.
Yeah, and this is St. Louis. This isn't some podunk, this is a huge, there's lots of schools. So this takes a really long time. And it makes the news, but, not front page news. Because for some reason, nobody cares about John and Jane Doe's, and I don't get it, especially when it's a baby. She's a baby.
Yeah, that I can definitely understand a lot more. Somebody has to know who she is.
Yeah. But the night that this made the news, it was not the first story they talked about on the news. It was after a commercial break or whatever. And the first story they talked about was the season finale of MASH. It's like, are you fucking kidding me? There's a baby girl who's dead. Why is that not number one? Like, whose kid is this?
Yeah, I have no idea. Yes, that's wild.
It is wild. They also had the added benefit of having to deal with all the crackpots that call in and admit to doing something, but they're lying. You know, they're like, oh, I did it. And then you find out they were in jail for like the last 3 years, so they couldn't have done it. And then this one guy, he like wanted the reward money to tell them where her head was, and they paid him $600 up front. He like drug him to Iowa and made him look in this forest because her head was in a tree, and it was all nonsense. None of it was true.
Jeez.
And he admitted he's like, oh, I just wanted the money.
Did he get it?
Well, they paid him $600 up front.
Oh.
Because he wouldn't tell them where the body was without them paying him something. But obviously they took it back.
Well, yeah,
I'm sure.
so like, what's even the point?
Nothing.
Oh my God.
And then another guy confessed to being the guy, and he had a skull on his mantle, and he had a machete. And some girl called the police and was like, he admitted that he killed her, and he has a skull on his shelf. So they went and checked that out, and it ended up being a toy machete that wouldn't cut anything. And the skull was not this child's skull. It was a skull from a science class, like a fake skull from a science class.
Okay, that's what I was hoping it was.
Yeah. So after 9 months of shitty leads like this that go nowhere and nonstop searching for her family and school records and everything else, by December, they decided that no family had come forward and that it was time to bury her. So the men who worked at the cemetery that dug her grave, the actual grave diggers, were her pallbearers.
Oof.
Yeah, and there was a couple officers, a minister, and a photographer from the local newspaper, and that was it.
Wow.
It was so sad looking at these pictures because this photographer from the local paper took pictures of the fact that there was 4 chairs set up next to the casket, and they were empty because there was no family there. There was nobody.
I mean, I guess it makes sense. They don't know who she is, where she's from, or really anything else about her. Who else is going to do it?
Well, you would think like the community would come together and do so, but by the time they buried her, it was like almost a year later, you know? Everybody had kind of like moved on. And obviously MASH wasn't on the air anymore, and everybody was way more upset about that. So even though these pictures are super duper sad, it was a really good thing that that photographer from the newspaper came, because 30 years later, that's going to be pretty important to this case.
Okay, let's keep going then.
So a nice couple who owned a monument company saw the story on the news about her being buried with no name. They wanted to donate a headstone for her with like a blank space for her name so that when they identified her, it could be engraved. But the cemetery that she was buried at was like, oh no, thanks. The ME's office said that would be inappropriate. And the monument company was like, well, that's kind of weird. They do gravestones all the time for John and Jane Does. How is that inappropriate? So a bunch of high school kids heard about this, and they wrote a letter to the ME's office being like, why can't she have a gravestone? Like, we don't get it. And the next day, the ME wrote back and was like, no, it's fine. It's like totally allowed. Kind of like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. So in May of 84, this monument company erected a monument in honor of her. And it's like a headstone, but it's like a statue one.
Like a whole thing? Like not just like hey, here lies, whoever?
No, it's like a statue one with like these angels and like an inscription. It's really beautiful.
Oh, wow.
So there's like the date in the middle that says February 28th, 1983. And then there's like a blank space for her name. And then at the bottom, it says the saddened hearts were healed in knowing the pain of life is over and the beauty of the soul is revealed.
That's a beautiful thing to say. Yeah. From what you've said, it sounds beautiful.
Yeah. It was kind of weird that the cemetery was really awkward about it.
Yeah.
And we'll get to why that is later, because this cemetery is very problematic.
Huh. Is that a sentence you've ever said before?
No.
Yeah, I didn't.
Actually, yes.
Really?
One time. Yeah, we had an issue one time with like a family member. We went to go look for their grave, and my mom and my aunts hadn't been there before. And we looked it up on like the map thing, and we went to where it said it was, and it wasn't there. And they got all weirded out because there was like something in the newspaper about them like reselling graves when people hadn't visited their family in a long time.
Like they know how often people are visiting their family, but I'm sure like old ass graves, I
don't know, but they freaked out about it. But then my aunt went back like 2 weeks later and it was there. They were just at the wrong spot or something. So I don't know. But yeah, that's the only other time I've ever heard of a cemetery being problematic.
That does sound problematic, but yeah, cemeteries are usually pretty work with you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, kind of normal.
Kind of like we do this all the time, and like no one really wants to be here, so we'll try to make this as easy as possible for everyone.
And I think they're pretty well watched and regulated by somebody. I don't know who, but somebody.
I guess somebody's doing it, right? It's got to be somebody's job.
Yeah, they have to be. So when VICAP was started in 1985, she was put in VICAP, like she was the first case that they put in VICAP in St. Louis. But that hasn't led to anything to this day. There's never been another crime similar or matching the MO or anything.
What is VICAP again? Just for those of us who are listening and don't know.
The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program.
Oh, right. Yeah, we knew that.
And they put cases in there so that, like, if different police departments all over the country all have little 7 to 11-year-old girls who are decapitated and have their arms tied behind their back, they can match cases together and then test them against each other to be like, oh, this is the same guy.
Yeah.
It's helped a lot with serial killers and serial rapists, like serial offenders. It helps a lot with.
Oh, well, good. I mean, it sounds like a great thing then.
Yeah. Then when NamUs was created, she was also put in NamUs, and there's never been any leads in that either. She's never been matched to any missing persons files or anything. So the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children have her in their system too, and she's the only case in their system without a photo or even a reconstruction, like a age progression, nothing, because they don't have her head.
Yeah. I mean, what are you going to do? Like, you can't really predict a body.
Yeah. They were so desperate for leads at some point in the investigation when they were contacted by the psychics. You know how that always comes about.
Yeah.
They were like, fuck it, we don't have anything else. Let's see what they got to say. Obviously, that led nowhere. But one of them told them that her head was in a boat in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's pretty, I mean, what are you going to do? Stop every boat and check? Like, hey, can we just check? Because Linda told us that you might have a head.
Yeah, that's so weird.
That's the one thing that I don't get about psych. I get it if people want to believe in that stuff, whatever. But why is their information always so vague? Like, if you're really a psychic, why can't you just say it? Why do you always have to hint at it? Why is it always a riddle?
I mean, I get where you're coming from, but I think when they do that kind of stuff, like I watch it and, you know, like I don't think it's an overwhelming, like, okay, your Aunt Dorothy is connecting me from the other side and saying, you know, you should get the cheeseburger at the Cheesecake Factory. You know, I mean, I think they get like inclinations, like, or like feelings towards something. And it may not be like overwhelming. They might be like, I'm not really sure what I'm feeling, but I feel like it's a woman.
That's what I'm saying. It's never sure. It's never like, this girl's name is Chelsea.
Well, I mean,
like, never.
I mean, it is kind of a made up thing in general too, right? Like, there's no way to check it. You're going off of somebody's feelings. Now, I won't discredit people's gut feelings because I do think that's very real.
No, of course.
But yeah, psychics generally don't really know what's going on. They got a gist.
Well, and there's no way to check it. How are you going to check every boat in the Gulf of Mexico to make sure her head's not, like, there's no way to verify that. So it's like, thanks a lot for nothing. So anyway, they get a bunch of anonymous letters. They have to track down every one of those, you know, from people who are like, I know this guy, Jim, he probably did it. You know, that's never the case either. So by 1990, this is 7 years later, they still have nothing. So one of the investigators went on Oprah to try to drum up leads, but that didn't help either. It did nothing. So
they got nothing about this little girl at all. They have no idea at all how any of this happened.
Nope. By 1994, Fonzie, you know the Fonz.
Oh.
Hey.
Henry Winkler, baby.
Yeah. He had a show called Sightings.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was about a bunch of psychics or something. I don't know. I didn't watch it.
I knew he had a show called Happy Days.
Right. But the cops said, yeah, let's go on this sighting show with the psychics. Like, if nothing else, obviously they don't think that a psychic's just going to tell them who she is because that never happens. But they're like, it's a TV show, so at least we can get her story on TV. So they agree to do this show, The Sightings or whatever, Sightings. But the psychic on the show says that she needs something to hold of the victims to be able to, like, channel her. So they sent her the sweater and the rope. The only two pieces of evidence in this case, they just
sent to a psychic?
Shipped them to a psychic, yeah.
This is the lawless land, man. I'm telling you, anything would happen. Anything happens at this time.
So they do the show. Nothing happens. Obviously, they don't know where she is. Psychics aren't real. And then she ships the sweater and the rope back, but gets lost in the mail. At least that's the story for like 30 years.
Right. I was going to say, like, okay, psychic, then tell us where it went.
Yeah. First of all, yeah. Second of all, I don't think that they're shipping the only piece of evidence in the most brutal murder in St. Louis history, just like USPS. I'm sure they sent it courier or some sort of police escort. There was something traceable with how they sent it. They at least sent it UPS, signature required. But for 30 years, everybody thinks the psychic never mailed it back or that it got lost in the mail. But this documentary reveal, like he interviewed the psychic and the police department, and she's like, no, I sent that shit back. I sent it with the receipt, the tracking, everything. She's like, you think they're just going to send it USPS? Like, come on. And then the detective on the case admitted that they received it. There's a signed receipt for receiving the evidence back, but they've since lost it, which is a way more believable story than it just like got lost in the mail.
That is a pretty good one, though. Just, oh, we don't know. It just got lost.
Yeah. But even when that documentary guy was like, why? Like, what? And they're like, yeah, we just like never really corrected that story because it's kind of funny to think that it got lost in the mail. It's like, it's not funny. And it's not funny that you guys lost it in your evidence room either. But I mean, shit happens over 40 years. But it does make you feel a little bit better, though, that it's lost somewhere in the police department, although it doesn't. But at least like maybe there's a chance of finding it someday.
Yeah.
If it just got lost in the mail, you'll never find it. But if it's lost in the evidence room, maybe it's in with another case or something, like it got filed wrong.
Whew, man, it's a lot of work.
Yeah. So it turns out it didn't get lost in the mail is the point of that, but it is lost. They don't know where it is. And they have moved police stations since then.
Oh, wonderful.
So it could have got lost in a move, which sucks.
Yeah.
Or it could have just got put in with a different case and they haven't come across it. I don't know. I don't know how they keep their inventory.
I'm surprised you didn't look into that. That does seem like something you would do.
No. Well, they're not real open about that on how police departments do that.
Oh, no?
They don't generally, no. They're not like, here, this is how we do it. Because then people will be like, that's not right. That's a big problem. And they're like, well, how would we lose evidence if we did it right? You know? Anyway. So this documentary has brought to light so much new shit or old shit that was like just kind of reported wrong from the beginning and then just rinsed and repeated over the years.
Yeah.
Like the sweater, he tracked down the manufacturer of the sweater because it's always been reported that the tags were ripped out so they didn't know where the sweater came from. But he's like, well, you don't need that to like find out who made it. So he tracks down all these like sweater manufacturers and textile experts and all this kind of stuff. And he figures out the manufacturer of the sweater.
How? How much effort to go through all this to find that out, you know? Like, that seems like so much.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it sounds like it's probably needed, but that's so much work to get that answer.
Yeah, unfortunately, that should be being done by the police, but it's being done by a documentarian who, by the way, this is his first documentary. So it's like, he's not even a documentarian. I mean, he is now. He just had this, like, I grew up here and this case has always bothered me and I need to do something about it. He literally knew nothing about filmmaking. He doesn't have, like, a background in it, nothing. So
I love it. I love that he's just like, oh, I'm interested in this and just went for it.
Oh, yeah. He's fantastic. So anyway, he tracks down all these textile experts or whatever, and turns out that it's a V-neck sweater from Robert Bruce brand, and it's a men's size medium, and it's yellow, and it was sold for $12 to $14 all over the country.
Oh.
At JCPenney's, Sears, like all kinds of department stores. It was like a real common sweater.
So it was no help.
But it was a men's size medium.
I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, and she had nothing on underneath it, which makes me think that it probably wasn't her sweater.
Yeah, it makes me think that too.
Because a little girl is probably not going to wear a super oversized V-neck sweater without an undershirt underneath.
No, certainly not.
I mean, most people don't wear, especially in the wintertime.
Yeah.
In February, most people don't wear sweaters without undershirts in them anyway.
Very true.
Where it snows. But then a little tiny girl wearing a men's size medium, how low would that V-neck have been? Way too low to not have a shirt on.
I mean, I guess it also depends on how deep that V is, right? Like, because if it like goes down to like your sternum, that's pretty big. But like if it's just like a V at the collar, then that's not so big.
Yeah. It does seem pretty big, though, if you look at pictures. I'll put some pictures on our Instagram.
I mean,
it's pretty
a
big.
men's size medium is small as a whole, but on a little girl, I'm sure it looks huge.
Yeah, on a 7 to an 11-year-old.
Yeah, of course. That looks massive.
Yeah. So anyways, back to the investigation. It's cold as ice by 1999, and that's when they tear down this vacant building. So this abandoned building where her body was found stayed in this neighborhood for another 16 years after they found her body. Like, that's, why would they leave it there for so long?
I don't know.
I know. And I read a bunch of reports about other crimes and murders and different things that happen in that neighborhood. It's like, you should probably get rid of this building. Like, it feels like a real good place where people do real bad shit.
It's like the Adres building on Chapman that was there for just like abandoned for like 20 years.
Oh, it was abandoned like our whole lives.
I know. It's like a dialysis center or something now, I think.
So, and that was in like on a busy street in like a decent neighborhood. This is like quiet with an alley behind it.
Yeah.
You know, bad shit, I'm sure, was going on in there. So anyway, seems kind of weird that it took them that long to tear it down. But when she was buried back in 1983, though, there was no DNA or isotope testing or anything like that. They didn't save anything to do any of that stuff. But by the early 2000s, those things are a real thing. So by 2004, the investigators started contacting different labs and agencies like the Smithsonian and asked like, hey, if we exhume her, is there any testing that you can do? And they're like, absolutely. We could do DNA testing. We could do isotope testing. Like, yes, exhume her. So in 2004, that's what they decided to do.
Oh, my God. Whew.
Yeah, but this would turn out to be a huge fucking mess, exhuming her.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would think.
Exhuming a body is usually not a problem. Usually they go to the grave and they dig it up and they exhume the body and they do DNA testing. But in this particular case, it's a huge fucking problem. Because remember I was telling you about that mess of a cemetery that she was buried at? And remember I was talking about how it was like real problematic?
Yep.
Well, apparently the owner committed suicide in 91 and no one had taken care of it since she died.
Oh.
And it turns out there was like a huge thing where she was being sued for some real shady shit, like burying bodies on top of each other in the same grave.
Yeah, I've heard that cemeteries have gotten in trouble for doing that.
Yeah, and not keeping records of where they buried bodies. So when they go to the cemetery to look for her grave to exhume her, there's headstones scattered everywhere that have been like moved. There's bones laying in the leaves and stuff because bodies weren't buried deep enough. Because they would dig a hole 6 foot deep and then they would bury 3 bodies in there, 3 caskets. So the top casket was only like a foot under the ground.
What does a cemetery do when they're full? Like just
close?
Yeah, I know.
I don't know.
Is that it? As a rule, though, I feel like we shouldn't be burying bodies anymore. We should be cremating them.
Well, where you live, for sure, because there's no room left because there's too many people. But there's lots of room in the country.
I don't think we should bury bodies, though. It's a waste of time, energy, materials. It's not good for the environment. I think we should everyone should be cremated. Just, all right, that's it.
Well, it is what it is.
Do you want to be cremated or buried?
So, I don't care. I don't want to talk about that. I want to get to this case.
I want to be cremated.
So, it doesn't matter. I'm going to be dead, so it doesn't matter.
A fucking men. That's what I say. Like, I don't care, but cremate me. Like, do whatever the cheapest thing is to get rid of my body.
Yeah, I don't know. I just don't want bagpipes played at my funeral. I know that's a big controversy, but I think they are annoying as fuck.
I think that's like a designation thing, and I don't think you're designated to have bagpipes played at your funeral, so I don't think you have anything to worry about.
Play bagpipes at anybody's funeral.
I mean, it's generally a very special thing.
Okay. So the point of that is that this cemetery is a fucked up mess. They dig up below her monument. Remember her headstone monument that they erected for her?
With the angels, yep.
Remember they weren't going to allow it at first, and then they were like, okay. So she wasn't under it.
Sorry, I must have misheard you. What?
Yeah, she wasn't under it. 3 other bodies were, but not hers.
Oh, wow. All right. What is this all about?
Yeah, it's a fucking mess. This place is it's a mess. So by 2013, this guy reads an article about this whole cemetery being a mess and them not being able to find out where Jane Doe is buried because her monument wasn't placed on her grave. It was like just wherever they put it.
Yeah.
And this guy watching this, or reading this news article, he's like, hey, my niece can probably find her. So it turns out this guy's niece, her name is Abby, and she's a PhD of computer science and was working on some technology like camera geometry, something. I don't know. And it's where you can try to locate things based on like historical photos and maps and stuff. So she's like a super cool nerd, pretty much.
Yeah.
So she contacted the investigators and was like, hey, I'd like to help. I saw a picture of the funeral from the newspaper and I think I can figure out where she's buried based on that picture if I could see the like original of the picture. They were like, cool, thanks. Please help us. You know, they needed help. So they contacted that photographer who luckily was a hoarder and still had the negatives of that funeral. Like 30 years later, and they developed them. And so she did a bunch of her like tech magic stuff because they could see in the photos like certain headstones and billboards and different things. But in real life, with all of that cleanup and having to clear everything, headstones got moved, so they couldn't really go by that. Those billboards that were in the original photos had been torn down and rebuilt like 15 feet over from where they were before. So like things were a little bit awkward, but she ended up working her magic And she didn't say like this spot specifically. She said, I think she's in this like 3 to 5 foot area somewhere right here.
Oh, wow.
And they were like, okay, let's get to work. And they started digging. And when they got 3 foot down, they hit a casket. And when they opened it up, it was the body of an adult and so with a head.
Oh,
so they were like,
that's not it.
Fuck.
Yeah.
But they kept going. And she was buried in her casket below that body.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
which could be part of the reason why the cemetery didn't want them to put that grave marker there, because they had already buried somebody else over the top of her.
Oh.
Yeah, see, she was buried in December, and it was May when they were trying to put this monument in. And by May, they had already buried somebody else on top of her. And so they probably didn't want those people's family to know that somebody was buried below their loved one. So they moved her marker like somewhere completely different that she wasn't buried.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty crazy.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So after all these years and everything, this is 2013 now. They finally find her body, and they were able to send samples to the Smithsonian and the University of North Texas for isotope testing, which is fucking whatever. I still haven't made up my mind on isotope testing because I have not yet researched a case where isotope testing has been accurate or like helped at all. So I don't even know about this because the University of Texas gave 10 states that she could be from, which is like, okay, at least it narrows it down from 50 to 10.
Yeah. That's significant for sure.
Yeah, totally. But then the Smithsonian gave like 10 states that were 10 completely different states from the ones the University of Texas gave.
Perfect. Okay.
They both ran the same isotope testing. And all the states that the University of Texas said were all in the South. Like all these 10 states in the South, but not Missouri. And then the ones that the Smithsonian gave were like 10 states all in the North, but also not Missouri. So it was like, so now we're like, we don't know. Who knows about isotope testing?
She's from the United States.
Yeah. So they kept samples for the DNA testing and all that stuff. But by February of 2014, she was reburied in the Garden of Innocence, which is like for child John and Jane Doe.
Oh, that's a nice name. Where's that? Oh, you're going to tell me.
It's at Calvary Cemetery.
In St. Louis?
Yeah. But it's much nicer than the place that she was buried before. And that service was beautiful. The funeral home that took care of her body gave her this like beautiful casket that has these like gold angels on the corners and stuff so that she'd never be alone. Like they really took a lot of care. They put her in like a beautiful pink dress and there was hundreds of people there. It was beautiful.
That sounds very lovely.
Yeah, it was lovely. So the last hope for this Jane Doe, besides someone coming forward and saying like, hey, that's my kid and here's my proof, is genetic genealogy, which C.C. Moore and Parabon Nanolabs have been working on for years now. It's her oldest unsolved case that she hasn't been able to solve. Yep.
Wow.
And they've ruled out tons of people, but haven't been able to figure out who she is.
This is always kind of those things that I go back to, that this very well could have been a child that was born into a situation where they weren't documented, you know, in anything.
Yeah, it could be. Genetic genealogy can still track down who that child's parents are. The problem that they're having with this child is the African American community is extremely underreported in GEDmatch.
Right.
And which is the only database they're allowed to use. The way C.C. Moore was explaining it is like they're represented in 23andMe and Ancestry and all that kind of stuff, but they don't seem to be uploading their DNA to GEDmatch. And they don't know if that's because like a distrust of law enforcement or what it could be, but the end result of it is that victims also suffer because they can't identify them if they don't have anybody to compare their DNA to. So they say they're as close as they've ever been though. Like they've tracked down relatives, but they're dealing with what could be like unknown parentage or like maybe an adoption. Like there's something wrong in the family tree where the tree on paper doesn't match what the genetics say.
Right.
So like maybe somebody's dad isn't who they thought their dad was. So on their paper tree, it's not lining up with their DNA tree. So she says they're like one upload away from narrowing down who Jane Doe is. But until more African Americans upload their DNA to GEDmatch, they're probably not going to get any closer than they are now.
Really? It makes sense. Definitely makes sense, but it's really interesting.
Yeah.
That there's a whole demographic that kind of collectively just isn't interested in this. Is this one of these weird white people things again? White people do weird stuff all the time.
Be.
Like, is this one of them?
Yeah.
We don't know what it is. And we just show up and we're like, well, we've been doing this. And they're like, yeah, that's weird white people stuff. Like, oh, all right.
Yeah, it must be, because every single genetic genealogy thing that we've researched, like whether it's Othram or DNA Doe Project or Parabon, they all say that the African American community is extremely underrepresented in GEDmatch. There's very little to go off of. So there's only really 2 theories, so I don't know if you really want to go all the way to Theoryland.
Oh, yeah. Theoryland!
Yeah, so the first theory is that she was abducted and murdered by a unknown assailant, somebody unknown to her and unknown to the police. Like somebody just kidnapped her, assaulted and murdered her, and then left her in that house. And she would have to be from out of state if that was the case, because somebody would be missing her in St. Louis if she was.
Yeah, 100%. Interesting.
Yeah. I feel like that's not very likely, because by this point, somebody would be missing her anywhere if that was the case.
Oh, and well, it's been so long, too. I mean...
Yeah. They would have connected her to a missing person's somewhere else by now.
Yeah, I mean, it's been 40 years.
Yeah, so the most likely scenario is that she was killed by a family member, somebody who was supposed to be taking care of her and in charge of her.
I mean, I do think that that's probably the most likely scenario, but these are the kind of things that you can't rule out. Kids being in bad situations and not being recorded.
Right, but that's still the person who was in charge of her.
Yeah, you're right.
How would a kid end up in a bad situation without her parents putting her there?
Yeah, good point. That's true.
Because if her parents were good, decent people, they would report her missing when she ended up in that situation.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it's most likely a family member, which is probably why the decapitation, because they didn't want her to be ID'd.
Man, that's terrible.
Yeah. So that's the story of St. Louis Jane Doe.
Well, that was actually really interesting. And I remember when you and those women at CrimeCon were talking, and I didn't know anything about it, and you were like, oh, it's so interesting. And I was like, yeah, they're usually not. But this one really was.
Yeah, they usually are. And sorry, guys, this didn't end up being quite such a mini episode as normal. But there's too much to go over, especially now that that documentary came out.
Yeah, no kidding.
Because he's like, hey, everything you've heard about this case is wrong.
Seriously. I mean, especially everything they thought they had going on. And then, you know, this guy brings it all to light. Like, no, it's all this way. That's big.
And it's not just like some documentary that's just like, oh, I think it's this way. I mean, he's talking to the actual investigators on the case, and they're like, ha, yeah, that's true. It's like, this isn't funny.
No.
Like, this is serious business. You got, like, people have been getting this wrong for years. So the only other little tidbit was a few months ago, there was a Reddit post about a girl who was missing her sister, that her mom went to jail in the early 80s, and they were living with their grandparents, and they had 2 different dads, and the dad came and picked her sister up in January of 83, and they've never seen her since.
Oh.
And that the dad was from St. Louis.
Oh.
Yeah, it did seem like a really good lead, but they've never been able to track down, like they were able to track down the poster and some of the players involved, but it doesn't seem that really lined up. And Cece Moore even posted something on Web Sleuths that she doesn't think it's a very good lead, which means she's probably already looked into it and ruled it out genetically.
Yeah.
Because she said it's not a good lead. I mean, she said a lot more than that, but she pretty much said, like, if this girl really thinks it's her missing sister, she should upload her DNA to GEDmatch so we can make sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And she won't do it?
I don't know. I don't know if that's even come to that yet, but I'm just saying, like, that's the whole thing, is if you have a missing cousin, family, or even if you don't, it could be somebody so distant from you, you don't even know they're missing. Just upload your DNA and you might be able to tell us who this little girl is.
This one sounds like it could be one that could get figured out.
Oh, yeah. It's going to.
Yeah.
It's just how long is it going to take?
Yeah. There should be an option when you do one of those things, like, do you want your...
Yeah, there should be.
Just do you want your stuff
100%
automatically
there should
uploaded?
be.
Like, yeah. Because honestly, it's a little, like, confusing to get it uploaded to GEDmatch anyway. So if they just had a button to push, like, hey, do you want this? Yep. Okay, great, thanks. Then it's done.
Yep.
Yeah. One thing we didn't think about, though, is if a judge loves the sound of his own voice, expect a long sentence.
Stupid. Was that your joke? That's a dumb joke.
It was a dumb joke, but that's kind of what they're supposed to be.
All right. Well, I love you.
All right. I love you too. Bye.
Bye.
This podcast has been a production of Orange Halo Media LLC, hosted by Grant and Erica. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. To chat with us, go to From Crime to Crime on Instagram, From Crime to Crime on TikTok, From Crime 2 Crime on Twitter, or you can visit our website at FromCrime2Crime.com. See you next Wednesday.